He slammed the gavel before she could speak. The chamber fell silent, tension heavy as iron in the stale air. Jasmine Crockett stood at her designated podium, her palms pressed flat against the wood as if searching for an anchor. She was only 6 minutes into her scheduled testimony, 6 minutes in, and the senator seated at the head of the table had already decided that her voice was of little importance. He cleared his throat, the microphone in front of him amplifying the sound, until it echoed off the polished floors and wooden benches. Even without a direct insult, the condescension in his tone was unmistakable. He waved a dismissive hand in her direction, demanding the chamber's attention for himself. Her proposal, he said, was both naive and unnecessary, and though his words pretended to be analytical, everyone in the room could sense the underlying hostility. Jasmine felt her heartbeat pound in her ears. She tasted something bitter on her tongue, the tang of adrenaline mixing with frustration. She was there to present a bill designed to protect whistleblowers, particularly those who had come forward about corruption in law enforcement. In the days prior, she had compiled an airtight case, each piece of evidence meticulously curated. She had names and testimonies, enough to disturb entire departments if properly investigated. This was no trifling matter, yet the senator, an imposing figure with silver hair and a disarming smile, made it clear he had little regard for her cause. His name was Senator Patrick Whitmore, a man who wore suits that cost more than some people's cars, a man who'd won the last election by branding himself as an agent of law and order. As he glared across the wooden expanse that separated them, Jasmine noted the practiced composure in his eyes, as though he had dealt with far more threatening figures than her. A single lawmaker from across the aisle, young and quietly passionate. A hush lay over the room. An entire line of onlookers, journalists, staff members, curious citizens, observed as Jasmine tried to resume her argument. She began to reiterate the necessity of her bill, explaining the climate of fear that surrounded whistleblowers who dared to speak up against intimidation. But the senator's interruption came swift and pointed. He snapped, "We've heard these bleeding heart speeches before. The question is, do we need another piece of legislation that burdens our agencies? Or do we trust them to handle allegations internally?" Jasmine's grip tightened on the edges of the podium. The dryness in her throat forced her to swallow hard before answering. She kept her voice measured, aware that any hint of anger would play right into his depiction of her, a hot-headed idealist. She said quietly but firmly, "We've seen what happens when agencies investigate themselves without oversight. Report after report has shown that those who speak out become targets. They lose their jobs or worse. This bill offers them a measure of protection, a promise that if they do the right thing, they won't be sacrificing their livelihoods or their safety." At that, the senator leaned forward, drumming his manicured fingertips against the polished table. Behind him sat several of his colleagues, men and women in suits of navy and charcoal, eyes shifting between Jasmine and him like spectators in a tense match. One or two looked sympathetic. Most wore an expression of polite neutrality, waiting to see which way the scales would tip. Whitmore's lips curved into a forced smile. "That's a nice sentiment, Representative Crockett, but it's misguided. Our departments are more transparent than you give them credit for. I'm not convinced we need your new measure. It's well-intentioned, but ultimately, it duplicates protocols we already have." He punctuated his words with a mild shrug, as though addressing a trivial misunderstanding. Jasmine held her breath. She wanted to retort with a scathing remark about the repeated failures of so-called internal investigations, about the men and women who had come to her office in tears, about the real intimidation tactics that overshadowed any illusions of transparency. But she also recognized this forum's delicate dance. She couldn't simply lash out. She had to choose her words carefully, one line at a time, building a chain of logic that was unbreakable. So she began to speak again, determined to outline the real stories behind the whistleblowers, the ones who had risked everything to bring forward evidence of misconduct. The senator let out a sigh, glanced at the clock, and made a grand show of checking his watch before resting his eyes back on her. 6 minutes. That's all it took for him to decide he'd heard enough. He turned to his colleagues, angled his microphone away from Jasmine, and began summarizing the session. He said it was time to move on to the next item on the agenda, that her concerns, though valid, could be revisited at a later date if they truly warranted that level of scrutiny. A wave of confusion rippled through the small crowd. They had expected at least a proper debate, perhaps a tense Q&A session, but not a sudden shutdown. Jasmine lowered her gaze, letting her frustration simmer behind her calm demeanor. She glanced around the chamber, seeing expressions of discomfort or resignation among the onlookers. No one wanted to confront the senator's blatant dismissal. The gavel's echo commanded the room again. "Next item," Whitmore declared. Across the aisle, another official cleared his throat, slightly uncertain. No one spoke. The hush was almost stifling, as though the tension had literally squeezed out all available oxygen. Jasmine's eyes flickered to the back of the chamber, where a couple of journalists scribbled notes. She wondered how they would frame this. Would they describe the senator's abrupt shutdown as another sign of political dysfunction? Or would they portray it as an unfortunate but necessary decision to keep the proceedings on schedule? The official who was meant to introduce the next topic hesitated, glancing at Jasmine as if to ask permission, but the senator bulldozed forward. "We have pressing issues to discuss regarding departmental budgets, which I'm sure all of us agree is paramount at this time." That wry half-smile returned to his face. "We'll hear your concerns another day, Representative Crockett. Perhaps you can revise and refine your bill in the meantime." He added a curt nod, a feigned politeness that stung more than outright rudeness. Jasmine felt her heart race. She wanted to grab the microphone, to insist that they couldn't just bury this issue beneath layers of bureaucracy, but decorum held her back. She was not naive. She understood how the senator used procedure to suppress debate. Still, she had facts, names, timelines, and she intended to get them on the record. Whether it happened that day or the next, she wasn't going to let this fight go. But for the moment, she had to cede the floor, stepping away from the podium in a swirl of her modest but professional attire. She kept her head high as she made her way down from the central platform, each footstep echoing softly in the hush. A faint quiver in her chest threatened to unravel her composure. She refused to let it show. Out in the hallway, just beyond the heavy double doors leading from the chamber, a small cluster of interns and staffers hovered. Some flashed her sympathetic looks. Others seemed merely curious. One timid intern approached, clutching a manila folder. He offered a quiet word of admiration, praising her courage for standing up to the senator. Jasmine gave him a tight smile, grateful but distracted. Her mind still buzzed with all the points she hadn't been able to articulate, all the evidence that she had painstakingly compiled but never got the chance to reveal. She stepped aside for a moment, leaning against the cool marble wall, letting the chatter from inside recede into background noise. She exhaled slowly and tried to steady her emotions, remembering why she was there in the first place. Stories of men and women who had come forward, who had put their reputations on the line, sometimes their very lives, to illuminate wrongs they witnessed. And she thought about the senator's mocking expression, that well-oiled facade of officialdom. The more she replayed those few minutes in her mind, the more she became certain that he was hiding something. She had always heard whispers about deals that got swept under the rug, about manipulations in budget allocations that never saw the light of day. Now she was more determined than ever to dig. She was no stranger to pushing past official stonewalling. She had been threatened, belittled, and even offered bribes in the past to let certain issues go. But she never had. And she wasn't going to start now. 6 minutes. That's all it took for Senator Whitmore to dismiss her. Jasmine promised herself that in the next 6 minutes, she'd find some new approach, some way to hold the senator accountable for his arrogance, if indeed it was masking something more sinister. She peeled away from the wall and headed down the corridor. She needed a quieter space, somewhere to plan her next move. A dull, fluorescent-lit hallway led to a side office that rarely saw foot traffic. She slipped inside, flipping on a desk lamp in the dimness. The overhead lighting flickered ominously, as if the building itself shared her unease. Settling into a worn leather chair, Jasmine opened her briefcase and withdrew several documents. Each page represented a fragment of a larger puzzle. Accounts of misconduct, references to hush money, internal memos that had been leaked to her staff. She looked at a highlighted name on one of the documents, an accountant from the senator's district, who had once tried to blow the whistle on certain irregularities. Her eyes narrowed. She remembered that conversation distinctly. He had talked about large sums of money funneled into unmarked accounts, about suspiciously edited expenditures, And at the time, no one listened. Or if they did, they pretended not to notice. A tide of emotion rose within her. She was convinced that if she followed these clues, if she tracked the financial footprints, she might discover a trail leading all the way to Senator Whitmore's office. But she also recognized how dangerous that could be. It was one thing to propose a bill that threatened to expose corruption. It was quite another to directly accuse a sitting senator of orchestrating financial manipulations. Jasmine tapped her pen against the edge of a folder. She recalled how quickly Whitmore had shot her down in that session. He was either supremely confident that she had nothing on him, or he was panicking behind his polished facade. The tension in the hallway outside her office grew as staffers went about their tasks, the sound of heels on tile and hushed voices drifting like echoes. She glanced at the wall clock. 10 minutes had passed since she left the chamber. The senator would be well into the budget discussion by now, leading the conversation, shaping the narrative. She suspected that behind his outward confidence was the knowledge that her bill, if it ever passed, could unravel secrets he wanted to keep buried. Jasmine rose from the chair. She was never one to wait passively. Tucking the documents back into her briefcase, she decided to reach out to one of the whistleblowers who had contacted her months ago, an ex-staffer from Whitmore's office. They had parted on uneasy terms when the staffer decided the risk was too great and withdrew cooperation. Perhaps now the staffer might be persuaded to talk again, especially if they saw how brazenly the senator was dismissing attempts at accountability. She stepped out of the office, walking briskly toward the exit. The corridor opened into a grand rotunda lined with stately columns. A few men in suits glanced curiously at her determined expression, but no one stopped her. Outside, bright sunlight made her blink as she descended the stone steps that led away from the imposing government building. Her phone buzzed in her purse, jolting her out of her single-minded focus. She fished it out to see an unknown number calling. Cautiously, she answered. At first, only static, then a hesitant voice, female, uncertain. The person asked if this was Representative Crockett, Jasmine affirmed, her pulse quickening. The voice introduced herself as Delia, one of the whistleblowers who had approached Jasmine's office a few weeks ago but never followed up. Jasmine recalled the name. Delia had claimed to have inside knowledge of a local department's cover-up. Her voice trembled as she explained that she had seen the hearing on a live feed. She witnessed how the senator dismissed Jasmine, and she wanted to help, but she also sounded terrified. Jasmine found a quiet corner near a granite pillar and pressed the phone closer to her ear. Delia spoke in hurried, fragmented sentences. She had documents that contradicted official financial reports. She had seen things that suggested more than just administrative errors. There could be direct links between certain campaign donors and the senator's personal accounts. She didn't dare say too much over the phone. Jasmine assured her that they could arrange a face-to-face meeting, discreetly, somewhere safe. Their call ended with Delia promising to text an address and time. Jasmine's heart pounded. She glanced back at the building behind her, with its tall pillars and the grand facade that gave the illusion of unimpeachable authority. She could still feel the sting of the senator's dismissal, yet deep down, a spark ignited. This was the momentum she needed. If Delia's information proved legitimate, Jasmine might have the leverage to expose the senator's hypocrisy. She breathed in the midday air, ignoring the swirl of chatter and footsteps around her. The tension that had built in the chamber was now morphing into a different kind of energy. A silent, fierce determination. She remembered the senator's smug face, how he cut her off, how he dismissed her cause like it was nothing more than a nuisance. 6 minutes of his time, that was all he offered before snuffing out the discussion. Yet, within that same span of minutes, she found a lead that could unravel his entire facade. Back inside the building, the session was likely progressing. Whitmore would be in full control, guiding budgetary conversations with the same patronizing authority he had displayed earlier. He might believe he had silenced her for the day. Perhaps he imagined that she would retreat, lick her wounds, and come back another time when his schedule was more amenable. He didn't know her well, if that was his assumption. Jasmine turned away, heading toward her car parked a few blocks down the street. She had an afternoon of phone calls to make, leads to follow, and a clandestine meeting to plan. She called her assistant, a calm yet resolute woman named Regina, instructing her to set up a secure location for an interview. Regina asked if it was urgent. Jasmine replied that it was more than urgent. It could change everything. The drive to her modest office space was filled with swirling thoughts of what might lie ahead. She knew the path would be treacherous. If Whitmore was involved in serious wrongdoing, he would not hesitate to protect himself. He likely had powerful allies, but Jasmine had grown accustomed to walking this tightrope. She had come from a background where the system had tried to crush her when she was still a teenager, speaking out against injustices in her community. She had learned then that silence was complicity, so she continued to speak, no matter who tried to stop her. Pulling into the parking lot behind a nondescript building, she hurried inside, passing a couple of staff members who offered encouraging smiles. She reached her private office, a room lined with plain filing cabinets and a single window that overlooked a narrow alley. Sitting at her desk, she powered on her laptop and waited for the screen to glow. First, she needed to cross-reference Delia's claims with her existing files. She typed queries into her secure database, pulling up records, scanning them for any mention of the alleged misdirection of funds. A pattern began to emerge. Smaller sums split into multiple accounts, obscure line items in budget proposals, the same donors appearing under different names. It was subtle, but if you knew where to look, it hinted at something significant. She jotted down notes on a legal pad, scribbling arrows and questions. Were these donors connected to corporate interests that the senator had championed? Had there been any links to policy changes suspiciously favoring these donors? Her mind spun with possibilities. Each new piece of evidence might form a crucial link in the chain. Regina knocked softly on the door. She peered in, her brow creased with concern. Jasmine waved her in. She handed Jasmine a slip of paper with an address and a time scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Delia just texted," Regina said quietly. "She wants to meet in a coffee shop about 15 miles from here, an hour from now. Should we proceed?" Jasmine tapped her pen against the desk, considering the risks. Meeting in public could be a double-edged sword, more open to eavesdropping but also less dangerous in case someone tried to intimidate them. She nodded. "Yes, let's go. But keep it low-key." She rose from her chair, grabbing her coat. Her eyes caught the clock on the wall, nearly noon. She figured the senator might still be ensconced in his hearing, parading his authority for the cameras. Let him enjoy his moment, she thought. He had no idea what was stirring outside those walls. The city bustled with midday traffic as she navigated her way toward the coffee shop. Regina followed in a separate car, as they'd long learned not to travel together when dealing with sensitive matters. Over the hum of engines and the occasional blare of a horn, Jasmine replayed in her mind the senator's dismissive gestures, how his voice had cut through the echo of the grand chamber. She refused to let it be the final word. She would see this through, no matter the obstacles. The coffee shop was in a quieter part of town, a place that seemed oddly removed from the busy thoroughfares. She parked and checked her phone for any messages before walking in. The space was warm but sparse, with plain wooden tables and a few overhead lights. The aroma of roasted coffee beans filled the air, accompanied by the steady whir of an espresso machine. A few patrons sat scattered around, faces buried in laptops or books. She spotted a woman near the corner, wearing a simple jacket and dark-rimmed glasses, nursing a cup of tea. Delia. Jasmine recognized her from an old photograph that had been attached to one of the whistleblower files. She approached slowly, heart pounding with the anticipation of what she might learn. Delia looked up and offered a tentative smile. Her hands were trembling slightly as she lifted her cup. Jasmine sat down across from her, keeping her voice soft. She thanked Delia for coming, for taking a risk. Delia exhaled shakily, glancing around as though expecting someone to be eavesdropping. She whispered that she had watched the hearing, that the senator's outright dismissal infuriated her. It reminded her of all the time she had tried to bring concerns to his office, only to be silenced or stonewalled. Jasmine nodded, encouraging her to continue. Delia confessed that she had access to an internal ledger, one that documented certain transactions not meant for public view. She said it showed money flowing from a handful of influential donors into funds that never went through official channels. And it wasn't just an oversight. It appeared orchestrated. She slid a small flash drive across the table, her hand shaking. Jasmine placed it carefully into her purse, heart hammering. If that data was authentic, it could be the key to proving corruption on the senator's part. But Delia also warned that she had received veiled threats after she tried to address the discrepancies internally. She suspected the senator's circle knew she was suspicious, That was why she initially backed away from contacting Jasmine. She had hoped someone else would step forward, or that maybe she was mistaken. But after seeing the hearing, she decided she couldn't stay silent anymore. Jasmine's chest tightened with empathy and gratitude. She promised Delia that she would handle the evidence carefully and ensure her anonymity as much as possible. They spoke for several more minutes, exchanging details, clarifying dates. Throughout the conversation, Delia's fear was palpable. Jasmine realized just how much courage it took for this woman to come forward. By the end of their meeting, she had a clearer picture. The scandal likely involved siphoning funds from major donors into a private account. Then, those funds might be used for personal luxuries or political machinations that wouldn't stand up to public scrutiny. It was the kind of wrongdoing that, if exposed, could ruin the senator's career and possibly lead to legal consequences. Delia left first, quietly stepping out of the shop with a final anxious glance. Jasmine lingered for a moment, thinking about how she would proceed. The next steps needed to be calculated. She'd have to verify the data on the flash drive, cross-reference it with other leads, and then decide whether to make a direct accusation or build the case further. This was a tightrope walk. If she moved too soon and the evidence was incomplete or easily dismissed, she could face a backlash that would undermine the entire investigation. But if she waited too long, the senator might catch wind and bury his tracks. She realized that the clock was ticking. 6 minutes. That was all it took for him to dismiss her bill, to wave off her concerns in front of everyone. Now he had no clue that in another handful of minutes, she had uncovered a thread that could unravel his entire public persona. The irony wasn't lost on her. She looked around the coffee shop, at the steam rising from the espresso machine, and the swirl of idle chatter. She felt both the weight of responsibility and a glimmer of hope. She couldn't help but think that she and Delia had just changed the trajectory of this fight. Gathering her belongings, she headed back to her car, glancing around to see if anyone might be watching. Paranoia wasn't new to her. She had learned the hard way that in political battles, you never knew who might be keeping tabs on your whereabouts. She drove back to her office, every moment brimming with a sense of urgency. The city's skyline loomed against a bright afternoon sun, but the roads felt strangely foreboding, as though the shadows of looming skyscrapers were a reminder of the hidden forces at play. When she finally returned to the unremarkable building that housed her workspace, she practically sprinted inside. Regina was there, waiting anxiously. "Anything concrete?" she asked, eyes flicking to the purse where Jasmine had stowed the flash drive. Jasmine nodded, stepping past her to enter her office. She locked the door behind them. Her hands felt unsteady as she booted up a secure laptop, one not connected to the usual office network. Carefully, she inserted the flash drive, waiting as the screen displayed folders of data. Regina hovered over her shoulder. Together they began scanning the documents. It was a trove of spreadsheets, emails, and scanned images of receipts. Some of the correspondences bore the senator's letterhead, while others referenced campaign efforts that seemed oddly unrelated to public statements he had made about his funding sources. The deeper they looked, the more they realized how meticulously these transactions were disguised. Portions of donor money would appear to go to legitimate causes, only to be redirected. Occasionally, code words were used in emails to reference these funds. Jasmine recognized the names of certain individuals who had publicly endorsed Whitmore's Law and Order platform. To see them appear in these suspicious emails made her blood run cold. If the public knew their money was being funneled into private luxuries or questionable manipulations, there would be an outcry. But the question was, how high did this go? Was the senator acting alone, or was there a network of complicit individuals? Jasmine sighed, leaning back in her chair. She rubbed her eyes. This wasn't just about exposing the senator's hypocrisy. It was about ensuring that systemic corruption didn't continue unchecked. She felt a wave of determination surge through her. She told Regina to start organizing the data, cross-checking names, and indexing anything that seemed relevant. Jasmine, meanwhile, made a call to a contact of hers at a reputable investigative journal. She wasn't ready to hand over the files yet, but she wanted to prepare them for what might come. The contact listened intently, promising to keep any conversation off the record until Jasmine gave the green light. The rest of the afternoon blurred into a flurry of analysis, phone calls, and quiet tension. Each document they opened seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. Over time, they pieced together a plausible narrative. The senator had made deals with corporations and wealthy backers, promising them favorable legislation or influence in exchange for generous financial contributions. But the contributions weren't all going through standard campaign channels. Some vanished into shell accounts, presumably for personal use or to buy the silence of anyone who might expose them. The picture was damning, but it was also incomplete. They needed direct evidence linking the senator himself to these transactions. A clear paper trail that he couldn't deny. A single sign-off, a signature on a questionable invoice, or an audio recording referencing these deals. Something that could end any talk of plausibly deniable ignorance. Jasmine's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Delia, saying she'd remembered a detail that might be important. A conversation she once overheard where the senator explicitly acknowledged the off-the-books funds. Delia believed she could track down an old email chain that referenced that conversation. Jasmine's pulse quickened. She typed a quick response, urging Delia to be cautious. Every step they took brought them closer to the senator's potential downfall, but also closer to a dangerous confrontation. She glanced at Regina. "We need to keep this contained until we're absolutely sure. If we leak this prematurely, he'll bury us in legal threats. And if he sees us coming—" She trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. Regina nodded gravely, understanding the stakes. The day wore on into late evening. Most staffers had gone home. The building was eerily quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights in the hallway. Boxes of documents were stacked along the walls of Jasmine's office, many of them containing old case files from her prior legislative efforts. She flipped through them, seeing if any prior testimonies or complaints about the senator's dealings might tie into this current revelation. The hours ticked by, and every so often Jasmine paused to reflect on how the day had begun. A brief hearing, 6 minutes of being silenced, the sharp sound of the gavel cutting her off, the senator's dismissive sneer. Now, after those few minutes, she was inches away from uncovering a scandal that could topple him. It was poetic, in a way. She couldn't deny a certain sense of poetic justice. A quiet beep interrupted her train of thought. Regina looked up from her workstation. "I think I found something," she said softly. Jasmine joined her at the desk. Regina pointed at a PDF scan of what appeared to be a personal memo. At the bottom was a signature. Jasmine leaned closer. The signature was unmistakable. Patrick Whitmore. He had scrawled it across a note authorizing the transfer of funds from a donor coordination project to a private consulting firm. The date aligned with one of the suspicious transactions in the spreadsheets. Her stomach flipped. This was the link they needed. A direct line from the senator to questionable money movement. And the words were telling. The memo explained that the firm would handle specialized outreach, which was code in politics for all sorts of behind-the-scenes maneuvers. This overshadowed any plausible claim that the senator was ignorant of how campaign contributions were being repurposed. Jasmine leaned back, letting out a long breath. This is big. She could almost see the headlines. Senator Whitmore authorized illicit funding transfers, orchestrated hush money, possibly defrauded donors. But she forced herself to remain cautious. They needed to verify that the signature was genuine, that the PDF wasn't forged. She grabbed her phone to reach out to a handwriting analysis expert she knew through her network, someone who had helped authenticate documents in previous investigations. She also planned to contact the firm named in the memo to see if anyone there would corroborate the story, or if records existed to validate the transaction. Regina continued sifting through the files on the flash drive, adding cross-references and notes. Meanwhile, Jasmine stepped outside her office for a moment, feeling the cool corridor air brush against her face. Her phone vibrated again, another text from a different whistleblower who had, until now, been silent. It seemed that news of her confrontation with Whitmore was stirring people to come forward. The text read, "He's been covering up for years. I have more. When can we talk?" Jasmine's shoulders tensed. This had the makings of a tidal wave. If multiple sources corroborated each other, the senator's fortress would crumble. But each new source also increased the risk of leaks, of infiltration by someone loyal to Whitmore, or of intimidation tactics. She typed a measured response, emphasizing the need for discretion. Returning to the office, she found Regina kneading her temples, exhaustion lining her face. Jasmine placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll take turns. You get some rest, and I'll keep going." Regina nodded hesitantly. "Just be careful. People have been threatened for less than this. Jasmine gave her a slight smile. We're not backing down. The hours dragged into late night. Jasmine pored over data, scanning for any mention of the senator's name, any coded references that might tie him directly to other shady dealings. Every once in a while, a piece would click, forming a clearer mosaic of systematic corruption. Finally, close to midnight, she decided to lock up the flash drive in a secure safe she kept in her office. She made encrypted backups on 2 separate external drives, aware that digital evidence could vanish or be corrupted if targeted. Caution was her greatest ally. She left the building, stepping into the darkness. The city lights shimmered in the distance and a few stray cars passed by. She felt the weight of the day in her bones, exhaustion from the emotional toll of that hearing, from the mental strain of piecing together evidence that could topple a powerful senator. But underlying that fatigue was a sense of unwavering resolve. All her life, she had stood up to bullies of various kinds. This time it was a political juggernaut with deep pockets and a ruthless grip on power. Yet she felt no urge to retreat. She got into her car, locked the doors, and checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a suspicious vehicle idling behind her. But the street was empty. She allowed herself a small, grim smile. Just because she didn't see it, didn't mean eyes weren't on her. Still, she refused to give in to fear. She would trust her instincts and proceed carefully. As she drove home, she recalled how the senator had looked her in the eye when he cut her off, how he relished the power dynamics in that moment. He might have assumed she was no match for him, that she'd slink away or bury her bill in committees that never saw the light of day. He didn't know that every time someone underestimated her, it fueled her more. Arriving at her modest home, she stepped inside and flicked on a small lamp. The quiet of the house contrasted sharply with the day's intensity. She shrugged off her coat, set her keys down, and thought about the next steps. She'd need to coordinate with her legal counsel to ensure all actions were airtight and beyond reproach. Then she'd have to reach out to a handful of journalists she trusted, preparing them for what might be a bombshell story. It was a lot to orchestrate, but she would do it carefully, methodically. She thought of the whistleblowers who risked their safety, the staffer in Whitmore's office who was bullied into silence. She thought of Delia, trembling as she slid that flash drive across the coffee shop table, and the quiet apology in her eyes for not coming forward sooner. It was a heavy burden, but Jasmine welcomed it. She slept fitfully, dreams filled with images of gavels striking a table, of documents fluttering in the wind, of a senator's smug grin turning into a look of shock. When morning arrived, she awoke with a clear sense of purpose. The day began with a series of phone calls. She reached her handwriting expert, who agreed to review the scanned memo. She also set up a secure line with the investigative journalist she'd contacted the day before. She wanted them to analyze certain documents under a strict agreement of confidentiality. Once that was underway, she arranged a brief meeting with her closest allies in the legislature, a small circle of representatives who believed in her cause. She decided to reveal just enough to convey the gravity of what she had, without showing them every piece of evidence. A delicate balance. She needed their support, but also to maintain security. They met in a cramped conference room in a building separate from the main legislative halls, not wanting to draw attention. As she spoke, describing the broad strokes of the financial improprieties she'd uncovered, she saw their eyes widen. A couple expressed immediate concern, understanding that if they took on a powerful senator, they could face political repercussions. But one older representative, a stoic man who had once been a civil rights lawyer, nodded firmly. "If what you're saying is even halfway true, we have a responsibility to act," he said. Jasmine thanked him, feeling a wave of relief that at least some in her circle recognized the moral imperative. Another representative asked about the timeline, whether she intended to make a public statement. Jasmine hesitated. She wanted to ensure the evidence was beyond reproach before going public. "I just need a little more time," she said. "There's a former staffer who might come forward with direct testimony. Once that happens, I think we'll have a rock-solid case." They offered cautious support, promising to protect her bill from immediate shelving while she gathered the final pieces of evidence. She left the meeting feeling a measure of reassurance. Back in the main legislative building, tensions were high. Rumors swirled that Jasmine was preparing to reintroduce her whistleblower bill with new revelations. When she passed through the corridors, some staffers gave her averted looks, as if they were frightened to be seen in her proximity. Others gave discreet nods of encouragement. Word traveled fast in these halls. Then she spotted Senator Whitmore in the distance. He was speaking with a small group of well-dressed individuals, lobbyists, perhaps, or important donors. He wore a practiced smile, but when his gaze flicked to her, a subtle change crossed his features. She detected a hint of wariness, almost as though he sensed she was a bigger threat now than she had been the day before. Jasmine maintained a steady expression, neither looking away nor openly challenging him. She walked past, the soft thud of her heels echoing. When she rounded the corner, she heard whispered comments from aides who scrambled to keep up with the senator. She imagined them feeding him updates about her behind the scenes. In the reflection of a polished display case, she caught sight of him glancing over his shoulder in her direction before resuming his conversation. She took it as confirmation that he knew something was brewing. Back in her office, she found Regina anxiously waiting with a man in a rumpled suit. He introduced himself as Jacob, a law clerk who had once worked under a judge that was close to Whitmore's circle. He said he had heard Jasmine might be investigating the senator. Jacob was nervous, sweat beading on his forehead, but he claimed to have access to depositions and sealed records that might shed more light on how Whitmore managed to dodge certain investigations in the past. Jasmine listened intently, but she also tested his sincerity with careful questions, suspecting a possible trap. However, Jacob's explanations seemed genuine. He shared specific details about how the senator's legal team maneuvered to keep certain lawsuits sealed, paying off plaintiffs under confidential settlements. It dovetailed with the pattern of hush money she had already uncovered. She let him speak, taking notes, occasionally asking him to clarify. By the time he finished, her mind was buzzing with the possibilities. Another puzzle piece, another avenue of evidence that pointed to a pattern of concealment. She thanked him and promised to keep his identity confidential for the moment. As he left, she couldn't help but marvel at how quickly the tide was turning. People who had remained silent were now stepping forward in a cascading effect. Perhaps the senator's brazen dismissal of her on the legislative floor had been the final insult that galvanized them. Or maybe the climate had shifted just enough to make them believe the senator was finally vulnerable. Either way, the window of opportunity was open, and she intended to make the most of it. The day stretched on, and she felt a knot in her stomach. She was consumed by the dual tasks of verifying new leads and anticipating the senator's counter-moves. Someone like Whitmore wouldn't sit quietly while she built a case against him. He would try to discredit her, question her motives, or even intimidate her witnesses. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed on the screen. She answered cautiously. The voice on the other end was cold with the slightest undertone of menace. "You're making a lot of noise, Representative Crockett," the caller said in a clipped tone. "Be careful. You might not like what happens if you keep pushing this." Her heart thumped. She forced her voice to remain steady. "I'm sorry. Who is this?" She heard a faint scoff. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when there are bigger fights in the future you might want to save your energy for." The threat was clear, though couched in vague terms. A chill ran through her. She looked at Regina, who watched her intently, immediately concerned. Jasmine ended the call without responding to the cryptic message. She placed the phone down, her hands trembling just a bit. She had been threatened before, but this felt different. It was more personal, more direct. She met Regina's worried gaze. "We should increase security measures around the office, and for our whistleblowers," she said in a hushed voice. Regina nodded, picking up her own phone to begin arrangements. The fear inside Jasmine was matched by a new wave of anger. If they thought intimidation would make her back down, they were mistaken. She would move forward with more resolve. She told Regina to expedite the process of verifying the senator's memo with the handwriting expert, to push the investigative journalist to brace for a potential big story. Jasmine felt like a runner on the final stretch of a marathon, exhausted yet more determined than ever. She recalled how the senator had once bragged about his unassailable reputation, how he boasted that decades in politics had made him untouchable. Now she was inching closer to exposing the rotten core beneath that polished veneer. Into the evening, she continued working, rummaging through archives, following the trail of obscure references. Finally, the handwriting expert called with a preliminary assessment. The expert believed the signature was authentic. There were no obvious signs of forgery. Jasmine breathed a momentary sigh of relief. It was not final proof, but it pointed in the direction she needed. She texted Delia, letting her know progress was being made and reminding her to stay safe. Delia replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji and a brief message. "Thank you for not giving up." Reading that, Jasmine felt the day's stress lift momentarily. Not giving up was a principle she had lived by her entire life. She closed her office door behind her that night, stepping out into the corridor, the overhead lights flickering. She wondered what tomorrow would bring. Would the senator find a way to twist the narrative? Would he call a press conference to discredit her? Paint her as an overreaching radical? She headed to her car with caution, scanning the dimly lit parking lot. The hum of distant traffic was her only companion. She gripped her keys firmly, thinking of all the people who were counting on her. Then she remembered how he had slammed the gavel before she could finish speaking, how the echo of that sound had followed her out of the chamber. The memory fueled her. She would make that echo haunt him instead. He dismissed her bill. He tried to dismiss her voice. And in doing so, he might have unleashed his own downfall. The following day, Jasmine woke early, a sense of both dread and excitement coursing through her veins. She spent the morning reviewing the data again, double-checking that the story was coherent and backed by concrete evidence. She drafted a statement she might release if the senator denied everything. In that statement, she carefully outlined the allegations, the documentation, the whistleblower testimonies. No sensationalism, just the facts. A short while later, she arrived at the legislative building, bracing herself for possible confrontations. In the hallway, a small gaggle of reporters approached her, mics at the ready. Word had spread that something big was brewing. One reporter asked if she planned to reintroduce her whistleblower bill. Another asked if she had any response to rumors that she was investigating Senator Whitmore's finances. Jasmine answered calmly, stating she intended to refine her bill and present new evidence of why whistleblower protections were desperately needed. She didn't reveal the details, but her measured tone suggested confidence. She could see curiosity and excitement spark in their eyes. She ended the impromptu interview quickly, not wanting to say too much yet. Soon after, she slipped into a side chamber, a smaller hearing room that wasn't in use. She sat down with a colleague, an ally who had a seat on the ethics committee. She shared a summary of her findings, carefully omitting specifics that weren't yet verified, but enough to convey the severity of what she'd uncovered. The colleague's face grew grim as Jasmine spoke. If this is true, he's in serious violation of multiple statutes. This isn't a mere slap on the wrist situation. Jasmine nodded. I know. That's why I need your support when I bring it forward. The senator will try to spin it as a political witch hunt, but the documents speak for themselves. Her colleague looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. You're stepping into a hornet's nest, he warned. Don't expect a smooth ride. Jasmine managed a wry smile. I've never had a smooth ride. Wouldn't know what to do with one. As they wrapped up the conversation, she heard the echo of footsteps in the hallway. Her colleague left, and she took a moment to gather her thoughts alone in the quiet chamber. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. She considered the magnitude of what she was about to set in motion. If she succeeded, Senator Whitmore could face a full-blown investigation, potential criminal charges, and a swift fall from grace. But she also understood the fight wouldn't end there. Corruption seldom existed in isolation. Others might be entangled. She steeled herself for the possibility that exposing Whitmore was just the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of closed-door meetings, discreet phone calls, and hush-hush exchanges of information. She heard whispers that Whitmore was preparing a statement about dangerous accusations swirling around, and that he planned to address the press soon. That evening, she received a message from the investigative journalist. They had examined some of the files and believed them to be authentic. They were ready to publish an exposé if Jasmine gave the green light, but they needed an official statement or an on-record source. She wrestled with the decision. Releasing the story too soon could give Whitmore time to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses, but waiting too long might mean losing the public momentum needed to pressure him into accountability. She decided to hold off just a bit longer, hoping to secure the final piece of testimony from that staffer who allegedly heard Whitmore admit to cooking the books. Right on cue, her phone pinged. It was the staffer, hesitant but ready to talk. They arranged a meeting late that night in a nondescript diner on the outskirts of town. She arrived with Regina by her side, stepping into the flickering neon glow of a place that smelled of frying oil and cheap coffee. The staffer was already there, face partially obscured by a baseball cap. Anxiety radiated from them. Over the next hour, they recounted an incident in which Whitmore explicitly ordered certain financial documents to be tailored to hide questionable donations. The staffer explained that they had tried to mention it discreetly to a higher-up, but were swiftly transferred and then let go under vague pretenses. Tears glistened in the staffer's eyes as they explained the sense of betrayal they felt, having believed in the senator's message of public service, only to discover blatant corruption. Jasmine's chest tightened. This was it, the direct eyewitness account that could corroborate the paper trail. She assured the staffer she would protect their identity as much as possible, but also gently explained that going public might be the only way to give their testimony the weight it needed. The staffer hesitated, fear warring with conscience. Ultimately, they nodded, saying they'd do the right thing if it came to that. Exhausted yet invigorated by the prospect of a breakthrough, Jasmine left the diner, feeling the cold night air grip her lungs. She glanced around, certain that if Whitmore had any watchers, they might have eyes on her by now. She drove home under the cover of darkness, her mind churning with the strategy for the coming days. She would present her refined whistleblower bill once again, this time armed with evidence that demonstrated exactly why it was necessary. She had people ready to testify, documents that laid bare the senator's malfeasance. He could try to slam the gavel on her again, but this time she would not be alone. That night she hardly slept. Thoughts of the hearing played in her head like a loop, the senator's voice dripping condescension, the final thud of the gavel. Then images of the new evidence, the signatures, the coded emails. Before dawn, she rose and prepared for what might be the most pivotal day of her political career. She entered the legislative building to find a throng of reporters buzzing with anticipation. News had leaked that Representative Crockett was preparing a major announcement concerning misconduct at high levels. She walked straight to the press room, a space with a podium and a simple backdrop. Cameras lined up in rows, microphones waiting. The atmosphere crackled with tension. Taking a deep breath, she stepped to the mic. A hush descended on the assembled crowd. In a steady voice, she began, "Good morning. I've called this conference to discuss a matter of utmost importance to our state and to the integrity of our governance." She felt her heart hammering, but she kept her gaze calm. She outlined the broad strokes of what she had found: undisclosed donations, suspicious ledger entries, misuse of campaign funds for personal gain. She deliberately refrained from naming Senator Whitmore at first, but gave enough detail that everyone in the room likely suspected who she meant. Then, with measured resolve, she stated, "I regret to inform you that the evidence my office has obtained points to Senator Patrick Whitmore's involvement in these illegal activities." The room erupted in a cacophony of shudders and shouted questions. She pressed on, explaining her intention to hand over her findings to the Ethics Committee and, if necessary, to law enforcement. She also mentioned that she was reintroducing her whistleblower protection bill with new data that underscored its urgency. She ended her statement by appealing to anyone with further information to come forward, assuring them that her office would do everything possible to ensure their safety. The moment she stepped away from the podium, chaos resumed. Reporters fired questions demanding details or sources. She gave measured responses, stating that more would be revealed in an official capacity once the legal steps were in motion. Her staff helped usher her out of the room before it devolved into a shouting match among the journalists. Outside the press room, she leaned against a wall, adrenaline coursing through her. Regina came up behind her with a look of anxious triumph. "You did it," she whispered. "Now we have to brace for the blowback." Jasmine nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. She could almost see the senator's reaction, the furious phone calls, the frantic damage control. She steeled herself for the storm, and storm it did. Within an hour, the senator's office released a statement calling her accusations baseless, politically motivated, and a gross misuse of legislative privilege. He demanded an immediate investigation into her conduct. On social media, his supporters rallied to his defense, calling her a liar, a grandstander. But the whispers that had been quiet before were now amplified. Journalists began dredging up old stories of rumored improprieties in Whitmore's career. More whistleblowers reached out to Jasmine's office, offering to corroborate. That evening, the major news networks covered the scandal as a leading story. Footage of Jasmine's press conference played side by side with archival clips of the senator boasting about his clean record. Commentators analyzed every nuance, debating whether the evidence would be conclusive enough to topple him. Some predicted she'd be crushed under his political machine. Others applauded her courage. The next morning brought a flurry of official action. The state's ethics committee, pressed by public outcry, announced a formal inquiry. A prominent law enforcement agency indicated they might look into campaign finance violations if the allegations held up. Jasmine was summoned to a private meeting with the committee to present her evidence. She arrived with stacks of documents, digital files, and statements from key witnesses who had agreed to testify under oath. The committee members, a mix of her peers and some allies of Whitmore, listened as she methodically laid out the case. The hush in the room spoke volumes. Even those who were staunchly in the senator's corner seemed uneasy. She showed them the memo bearing Whitmore's signature, the bank transfers, and coded emails referencing hush money. She summarized the whistleblower testimonies, emphasizing their consistency. When she finished, the room remained silent for several heartbeats. The chairman of the committee, a graying man who had served in office for decades, finally cleared his throat. His voice was grave as he acknowledged the seriousness of her claims. He assured her they would be thoroughly investigated. Outside the door, reporters waited like a pack of hounds. She gave a short statement. "I have full confidence in the committee's ability to scrutinize the evidence. This isn't about me or the senator personally. It's about accountability in our government." Then she slipped away, not wanting to be drawn into more questions she wasn't ready to answer. Her phone pinged with a message from Delia. "Stay strong, we're all behind you." Another text arrived from the former staffer, saying they were ready to speak to the committee if needed. Each message strengthened her resolve. As she made her way through the corridors, she spied the senator at the far end of the hallway. He was surrounded by aides and a couple of security personnel, his face red with anger. His eyes locked onto hers briefly, and there was no mistaking the cold hostility in his stare. She returned his gaze, unflinching. They passed each other without a word, the tension tangible. The building seemed to hold its breath. The next few days were a gauntlet of press coverage, public debate, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Whitmore appeared on a news segment, calling her a radical who wants to undermine the institutions that protect our society. He insisted the allegations were a smear campaign, but, in that same broadcast, the network ran interviews with individuals who claimed to have witnessed unethical practices in his office. The shift in public sentiment was evident. For every loyalist who defended him, a growing number of voices demanded he come clean or step aside. Whistleblower protection became a hot topic overnight, with coverage focusing on the personal stories of those who had risked careers and reputations to expose wrongdoing. Public opinion polls began to show waning support for the senator and increased sympathy for Jasmine's stance on accountability. At the ethics committee hearing, more evidence was presented. Delia provided a sworn statement. The staffer delivered testimony via a secure video link, detailing how Whitmore had personally ordered the alteration of records. The committee took everything under advisement, and the atmosphere was electric with the possibility that a once powerful figure might finally face consequences. And through it all, Jasmine never lost sight of that moment the senator had cut her off. 6 minutes into her testimony, the gavel slamming like a door shutting in her face. She thought about how close she'd come to losing that opportunity to speak. If she had allowed him to silence her, none of this might have come to light. The final blow landed a week later, when an email surfaced, directly implicating Whitmore in negotiations for illegal campaign contributions. It was from the senator to a wealthy donor, discussing how to funnel money in a way that wouldn't attract official scrutiny. The authenticity was verified by multiple experts. Overnight, Whitmore's allies began to distance themselves. The walls of his fortress were crumbling. An emergency press conference was called. Whitmore, looking haggard and no longer wearing his trademark confident smile, tried to spin the narrative one last time, claiming the email was taken out of context, but the damage was done. Calls for his resignation reverberated through the legislature and the public. Less than 24 hours later, He announced he was temporarily stepping down from his committee leadership roles, pending the outcome of the formal investigation. It was, in essence, an admission that he had lost the power he once wielded so arrogantly. As the news broke, Jasmine stood in her office, exhaustion etched into her features. Regina burst in, tears of relief in her eyes. "He's stepping down," she said, voice trembling. Jasmine nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. She felt no need to celebrate loudly. A quiet satisfaction washed over her, coupled with a deep gratitude for everyone who had put their trust in her. She also felt a resolve to push forward with the whistleblower bill, to ensure that the events of these past days served a higher purpose. A press crew awaited her outside the building. She stepped out, surrounded by microphones and cameras. They asked how she felt. She told them she believed in the power of truth and the courage of those who come forward to expose wrongdoing. She said she was proud to reintroduce her bill, now bolstered by undeniable evidence of why such protections were necessary. As she finished speaking, she glanced up at the building that housed so many secrets. She thought again of how fleeting those initial minutes of her testimony had been, how easily a single gavel could stifle an entire argument. But truth had a way of surfacing, even against the weight of power. It occurred to her that in the grand scheme of things, 6 minutes was barely a breath, but it was enough for the senator to show his hand, and enough for her to find the path that led to his downfall. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Jasmine Crockett stood firm, the embodiment of quiet defiance. She felt the presence of those whistleblowers behind her, like an invisible choir, each voice joining the chorus until their collective stand became impossible to ignore. And as the crowd buzzed, one last echo of the senator's dismissive sneer played in her mind. She let it pass. He had slammed the gavel to silence her, but he'd only succeeded in amplifying her resolve. There was no more denying the unstoppable momentum that had grown in the span of those few short minutes, shifting the balance of power in ways neither he nor anyone else could have foreseen.